Microsoft doesn't dominate the tech world because it builds the most exciting products. In fact, many of Microsoft's products are ordinary. So how did a company with relatively ordinary software become one of the most powerful forces in the global economy? Why do governments run on it? Why do banks rely on it? Why do corporations organize their entire workflow around it? And why is it so difficult to escape once you start using it? To answer that, you have to understand something most people miss. Microsoft doesn't really sell software. Microsoft sells standards. And once a standard takes over an industry, the entire world quietly starts building on top of it. But what does that actually mean? How does something boring become so powerful? And why do smart organizations keep paying even when they complain? Here's the map: 3 layers. Layer 1, defaults. Layer 2, formats. Layer 3, infrastructure. If you understand those 3 layers, you understand Microsoft. Layer 1, defaults. Let's start with something almost everyone has experienced. You open a laptop for the first time. The operating system is already there. You didn't choose it. You didn't install it. It was simply waiting for you. For decades, that system has usually been Windows. Why does that matter? Because defaults shape behavior far more than most people realize. When something is already installed, already configured, and already familiar, most people don't evaluate alternatives. They continue. They adapt. They accept. Why would they create friction on purpose? Why would they risk breaking what already works? Why would they spend mental energy switching if their job isn't optimizing software? Most people don't choose the best tool. They choose the tool that doesn't cause problems. And Microsoft understood that early. Instead of competing device by device, Microsoft focused on becoming the invisible layer underneath the device, the operating system. In the early PC era, hardware manufacturers built machines, but they needed software to make those machines usable. Microsoft supplied that software and licensed it broadly. Different brands, different hardware, different prices, but the same operating system. That's not just scale, that's a language. Windows became the common language of personal computing. And once millions of people learn a language, switching becomes harder than it looks. Think about what people actually learn. Not computers. They learn habits, keyboard shortcuts, file paths, menus, IT policies, workarounds. All of it becomes muscle memory. So when a company considers switching the underlying system, what are they really considering? Not a new OS, a disruption, retraining, compatibility risk, downtime, and in institutions, the real currency is risk. So ask yourself, would a hospital choose disruption? Would a bank choose uncertainty? Would a government agency choose, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't? Of course not. So the default stays, not because it's perfect, because it's safe. And safety is what standards sell. Layer 2, formats. But Windows alone wasn't the masterstroke. The masterstroke was what Microsoft placed on top of Windows. Office, Word, Excel, PowerPoint. At first, these tools looked like digital versions of paper documents, spreadsheets, and presentations. But then something subtle happened. They became the expected format of work. And expected is stronger than preferred, because preference is optional. Expectation is pressure. When a financial analyst sends a spreadsheet, what format is expected? Excel. When a consultant delivers a deck, what format is expected? PowerPoint. When a report is shared across departments, what format is expected? Word. Now ask the real question. Who enforces that? Not Microsoft. The workplace does. Your client does. Your boss does. Your team does. The market does. That's the genius. Once the format becomes standard, Microsoft doesn't need to force you to use it. You do it voluntarily. to stay compatible. And once a standard becomes embedded inside millions of workflows, replacing becomes extremely expensive, not because alternatives don't exist, but because everything built on top of the standard would also need to change. Every template, every macro, every training guide, every automated report, every internal workflow that depends on that one spreadsheet. Be honest. Have you seen an organization running on a handful of Excel files nobody is allowed to touch? Of course you have. So what happens if you switch? What happens if formulas behave differently? What happens if macros break? What happens if a shared model doesn't convert cleanly? What happens if a tiny compatibility issue becomes a giant operational problem? Multiply that by thousands of employees. Multiply it by compliance. Multiply it by executive impatience. This is why companies don't replace Excel. They tolerate Excel. They build around it. They fear touching it. And fear is sticky. So by the time an organization wants out, it's not switching software. It's unbuilding years of work habits. And habits don't like being removed. The business model shift from product to rent. Now Microsoft takes those standards and monetizes them the smart way. In the old model, a company bought software once and used it for years. Revenue came in waves, big upgrade cycles, then quiet periods. Predictability was weak, so Microsoft changed the model. Instead of selling Office once, they began selling continuous access, subscriptions. Microsoft 365 transformed Office from a product into an ongoing payment built into the cost of operating a company. And here's the psychological trick. The subscription doesn't feel like a new purchase. It feels like maintenance. It feels like staying supported. It feels like avoiding risk. And who wants to be the IT leader who saved money and created exposure? Who wants to be responsible for running outdated systems? Who wants to explain a breach or downtime and admit they cut the wrong corner? So the subscription becomes the new default, not a technical default, an organizational default. And how well does this rent model work? In 2024, Microsoft's Intelligent Cloud segment alone generated over $100 billion. And that's before you count the rest of the enterprise stack. That's not a product cycle. That's a compounding toll system. Layer 3, infrastructure. But Microsoft didn't stop at documents. They turned Office into a workplace environment. Files moved into the cloud. Collaboration became real-time. Permissions became granular. Identity became central. And communication got pulled into the same gravitational system. Teams. Now ask, what is Teams really? A chat app or the place work happens? Because once your meetings, chats, files, approvals, and collaboration are centralized, leaving doesn't mean swapping tools. Leaving means rewiring the company. And how many organizations want to rewire themselves? How many executives will approve months of disruption just to say, we switched software? Exactly. This is where the strategy becomes clear. Microsoft sells a stack. Windows as default environment. Office formats as the language of work. Microsoft 365 plus Teams as the workplace operating layer. Identity as the gate to everything. Cloud as the foundation underneath it all. And the pillar most normal users never even see is cloud infrastructure. Azure. Most employees don't interact with Azure directly, but enterprises do. And cloud foundations are hard to replace. Migrating cloud platforms can involve rewriting architectures, moving massive data sets, redesigning security frameworks, and retraining engineering teams. That's not a switch. That's a multi-quarter project with career risk attached. So no, companies aren't trapped. But switching is painful enough that most won't do it unless forced. Because the pain of switching is immediate, while the benefits are delayed, uncertain, and political. And politics inside organizations is real. Who owns the migration? Who pays for it? Who gets blamed if something breaks? Who gets credit if it works? And what if it works perfectly and no one notices because you just spent months changing something invisible? So most organizations do the easier thing. They complain. They bolt on alternatives. They say they'll reduce dependency. Then they renew anyway. That is a standard effect. Why governments and banks choose Microsoft? Now we can answer the earlier questions. Why do governments run on Microsoft? Because governments optimize for procurement safety, long-term support, compliance, and continuity. Why do banks rely on it? Because banks optimize for stability, auditability, identity control, and security posture. Why do corporations organize their workflow around Microsoft? Because corporations don't buy tools. They buy predictability. And Microsoft's real product is predictability packaged as software. This is also why trust matters, not as a vague feel-good word, but as a risk minimizer. Trust means a vendor will still exist. Support will still exist. Hiring talent that already knows a stack will still be easy. Compliance documentation will still be there. And the most uncomfortable truth? Standards reduce blame. If a standard fails, it feels forgivable. If a weird, custom tool fails, it feels like your fault. That's why standards spread. They don't just reduce technical risk. They reduce career risk, the quiet durability. Of course, the tech world evolves. Open source grows. Competitors challenge. Cloud competition is fierce. But Microsoft keeps adapting without breaking the standard. Windows integrates cloud identity. Office becomes Microsoft 365. Teams becomes the meeting layer. Developer ecosystems expand. Security tooling expands. AI appears inside productivity and cloud platforms. Each evolution adds a layer. Each layer deepens integration. And the key is that it still feels like the same environment. Organizations don't want a revolution. They want continuity with upgrades. So when people say Microsoft is boring, they're right. But they miss the point. Boring is exactly what makes it powerful. Because boring becomes the environment. And when a platform becomes the environment, it stops feeling optional. It becomes expected. So the next time you open a spreadsheet, join a Teams meeting, or store a document inside a Microsoft connected workspace, ask yourself, are you using a tool, or are you reinforcing a global standard? Are you choosing Microsoft, or is Microsoft choosing you through defaults? Are you paying for features, or paying rent to an infrastructure that's hard to unbuild? Because Microsoft is not the only company playing this game. Microsoft is not the only company playing this game. Apple traps your identity. Amazon traps your logistics. NVIDIA traps your developers. And Microsoft traps your workflow. Other companies are trying to become the default layer of payments, the default layer of communication, the default layer of identity, the default layer of AI inside your workflow. And once defaults take over, you don't notice the moment you stop choosing. You just wake up one day and realize the world is already built on top of it. Stay aware, stay curious, stay kind. Source: Microsoft Annual Reports, Form 10K, selected years. Public documentation on Windows, Microsoft 365, and Azure Cloud Services. Research on behavioral economics, default effects, and technology platform adoption. And ask yourself one final question. If Microsoft built its empire by becoming the default layer of the digital workplace, which company is trying to become the next global default? And will we notice it before the entire world quietly begins building on top of it?